Sometimes the quietest streets hide the loudest screams. It was just after midnight when dispatch received the call. A neighbor on Hollow Creek Road, Greer, South Carolina, reported what sounded like screaming, muffled, distant, and coming from underground. At first, officers thought it was a domestic dispute. Hollow Creek was a quiet stretch of road, lined with oak trees and weathered houses where everyone waved, even if they didn't know your name. But that night, behind a sagging blue two-story home at the very end of the street, police would uncover something far darker than a simple fight. Something that had been hiding there for years. His name was Earl Raymond Haskins, 52 years old, a handyman, a man most people described as odd but polite. He fixed engines, painted houses, and occasionally helped elderly neighbors with home repairs. He didn't talk much, and when he did, it was usually about cars, the weather, or his old hunting trips. Nothing about him screamed danger. But underneath his house on Hollow Creek Road, Earl had built a world that no one could see. A world where 4 people were trapped, starved, and silenced. Earl's home sat at the far end of the road, partly hidden by overgrown trees. No one ever visited. His driveway was always cluttered with rusted tools and old car parts. The windows were sealed tight, and the basement door was chained shut from the outside. When police later entered the house, they said the first thing they noticed wasn't the smell, it was the silence. The kind of silence that feels wrong, too heavy, too still. But to understand how this nightmare came to be, we have to go back to when people first started disappearing. The first was June Hollister, a 68-year-old retired nurse who lived alone after her husband Frank fell ill. June was known for baking cookies for neighborhood kids and volunteering at the local clinic. In March 2018, she vanished. Her car was still in the driveway. The door was unlocked. Police searched the area, but there was no sign of struggle. No forced entry, nothing missing. Neighbors assumed she'd left to care for family out of state, but she hadn't. 2 weeks later, her husband Frank also disappeared. He'd been seen wandering near a gas station on Hollow Creek, confused, asking for his wife. Security cameras caught him talking to a man in a green pickup truck. That man was Earl Haskins. At the time, it meant nothing, but later it would mean everything. The third disappearance came 2 years later. Emily Cross, 33, recently divorced and struggling to make ends meet. She met Earl when her car broke down outside his shop. He offered to fix it cheap, and they struck up a friendship. When Emily's lease ended, Earl told her she could stay in his spare room until she found a new place. She never left. Her phone went dead. Her Facebook went silent. Her friends filed a missing persons report, but again, nothing. No trace. And then came the last one. Kayla Monroe, 27, a waitress with big dreams of moving to Atlanta. She met Earl online. He seemed charming, older, stable, the kind of man who could offer her some peace. They dated briefly. Then one day she told her sister she was moving in with him. For a while, that was 2021. No one heard from her again. 4 people, gone, all connected to one man who seemed to vanish from their stories as quickly as they vanished from the world. To the outside world, Earl Haskins was lonely but harmless. He lived simply, paid cash, and minded his business. He mowed his lawn every Saturday at exactly 8 a.m. He waved to the mailman. He even attended church twice that year. But Earl's quiet habits weren't signs of normalcy. They were camouflage. He was a man obsessed with control. Behind the facade of a lonely handyman was someone who thrived on domination, on bending people until they broke. He wasn't driven by lust or money. He was driven by power. The feeling of being a god inside his own hidden world. When police finally searched the basement, they found what he'd been building for years. A self-contained underground structure, part workshop, part prison. Cement walls lined with metal sheets. 2 small rooms divided by plywood. Locks on both sides of the doors. And cameras, dozens of them, pointing inward, not outward. The basement was soundproofed. The only ventilation came through a vent that led up into the kitchen. That's how the smell eventually escaped. June and Frank Hollister were the first. Haskins had lured them in with kindness, offering to help when their home needed repairs. He gained their trust, then took it away, slowly. He convinced them to stay with him for a few days while their plumbing was fixed. But once inside his house, he locked the basement door. For years, they were kept alive on scraps, canned food, stale bread, and water from a hose. June kept a small notebook hidden beneath a mattress, where she wrote short notes to herself. Stay quiet. Remember who you are. Frank is fading. When Frank became too weak to move, Earl stopped feeding him. June begged, pleaded, prayed, but Haskins only watched. And then, as if replaying his own cruelty, he found new victims. Emily, then Kayla. He told each woman they were special, that he was saving them, that the world outside didn't care about them. And for a while they believed him, until the beatings, the hunger, and the darkness became their reality. By the fall of 2023, June was the only one still trying to fight back. Frank had passed away. Emily and Kayla were frail, terrified, and silent. Then one night, Earl slipped. Literally. He fell down the basement steps while carrying supplies. Emily saw her chance. She grabbed the nearest thing she could, a metal pipe, and struck him. The hit wasn't enough to kill him, but it drew blood. Earl screamed. Emily screamed back. That scream, echoing through the vent, was what finally reached the outside world. A neighbor, awakened by the noise, called 911. When officers arrived, Earl met them at the door, calm and smiling. He said his girlfriend had a mental breakdown. He said she was fine now, but something wasn't right. One officer noticed blood on Earl's shirt and a smell, faint but distinct, drifting from the floor vents. When asked about it, Earl froze. That pause was all it took. Within minutes, police were searching the home. They found a locked door hidden behind a freezer in the kitchen. Earl tried to stop them, yelling that it was private property. They ignored him, and when they broke the lock and stepped inside, the world above vanished. What they found inside the basement was like something from a nightmare. June Hollister was curled in the corner, weak but alive. Emily and Kayla were trembling, whispering that he's still here. And Frank, wrapped in an old blanket, lay lifeless beside a small wooden cross made of sticks. The air was thick with mold and decay. The walls were covered in scribbled notes, prayers, names, numbers, and tally marks counting the days. When officers led the women out into the night air, they said their eyes couldn't adjust. They hadn't seen daylight in years. Earl Raymond Haskins was arrested that night on multiple charges, including false imprisonment, aggravated assault, and murder. Neighbors stood on their lawns watching as blue and red lights painted the house that had stood silent for so long. The quietest man on the street had been hiding the loudest screams. For years, the basement on Hollow Creek Road had been a tomb for the living, a place where trust turned to terror, and silence became survival. But what investigators would uncover after Haskins' arrest, his journals, his recordings, and his chilling letters, would reveal just how deep his obsession ran. When the door finally opened, the truth came spilling out with it. The rescue on Hollow Creek made headlines across the state, but for investigators, the story had only begun, because every inch of Earl Haskins' property whispered a question no one could answer. How could this have gone on for so long without anyone knowing? Detective Laura Mendez stood in the center of the basement that first morning after the arrest. Condensation dripped from pipes overhead. The air was thick with mildew and the ghost of human suffering. On the folding table lay the first set of recovered items: a spiral notebook filled with crude sketches of locks and cages, a digital recorder, and 4 metal tags engraved with initials: J, H, F, H, E, C, and K, M. He cataloged them, Mendez said quietly. Like projects. The forensics team logged everything, even the clock on the wall, whose hands had been painted over so time would never move again. 3 women were transported to Greenville Memorial Hospital under fake names for protection. For days, they refused to speak. Then slowly, words began to emerge. June Hollister, frail but fierce, described how Earl promised safety after a storm flooded their house, and how that promise turned into chains. Emily Cross admitted she had defended him at first, convinced he just wanted to be loved. Kayla Monroe, the youngest, could barely make eye contact. She simply said, "He liked the dark." He said light made people lie. Each story was a fragment, but together they formed the blueprint of control: kindness, dependence, punishment, silence. At the county jail, Haskins sat through his interrogation with the calm of a man discussing weather. He called the basement his workshop. He called his captives family. When asked why he locked them away, he smiled. "You can't lose people if they can't leave." Psychologists later described his behavior as compulsive captivity syndrome, a delusion rooted in abandonment and the need to dominate. But to Mendez and her team, it was simpler than that. He was a man who wanted control so badly, he built walls to keep it. Greer was stunned. Reporters crowded the narrow street. Neighbors replayed every small moment they'd ignored. The boarded-up windows, the missing dog that wandered into Haskins' yard and was never seen again. The strange humming sound at night that everyone assumed was a generator. A retired mail carrier admitted he'd once heard crying through the vent near the porch, but told himself it was a television. "You don't think something like that can happen right next to you," he said, "so you convince yourself it didn't." The town held a candlelight vigil outside the property. No one went near the basement door. The trial opened 8 months later in the Spartan County Courthouse. Haskins refused a plea deal. He claimed the women had chosen to stay. Prosecutors presented a chilling video from his basement camera system, grainy footage of Earl pacing, lecturing the captives about obedience, forcing them to recite rules. Gasps filled the courtroom. When June took the stand, she lifted her trembling hands and said, "He took our light away, but not our voices. We have them back now." That single sentence sealed the verdict. After 3 weeks of testimony, Earl Raymond Haskins was convicted on all counts: murder, kidnapping, unlawful imprisonment, and assault. The judge sentenced him to life without parole. He showed no emotion. As he was led away, he turned once toward the gallery and whispered something no one could quite hear. Kayla later said she saw his lips form the words, "They'll come back." The survivors entered rehabilitation programs funded by the state and donations from strangers across the country. Emily learned to drive again. June moved into an assisted living home surrounded by sunlight and noise she no longer feared. Kayla began painting, her canvases streaked with black and white lines she called air vents. The house on Hollow Creek Road was demolished 6 months after the sentencing. During demolition, workers found something hidden inside the foundation, a small metal box containing photos of sunsets cut from magazines. On the back of one photo, Haskins had written, "Light belongs to me." The box was sealed in an evidence locker, never displayed. Detective Mendez retired the following year. When asked in an interview what haunted her most, she said it wasn't the basement or the smell. It was the normalcy. He wasn't a monster in the shadows. He mowed his lawn. He waved at kids. He looked ordinary. That's what evil looks like when it's comfortable. The FBI later analyzed Haskins' journals and concluded that he had planned expansions to his underground space. Additional rooms labeled new arrivals. No one knows if he had already chosen new victims. The basement is gone now, replaced by a patch of grass that refuses to grow. But for the people who survived it, Hollow Creek Road will always be a map of what human cruelty can hide behind a smile. Evil doesn't always knock. Sometimes it builds a home and waits for the world to look away.